He entered that room alone, with only a file in his hand, and the true power of the truth. Stephen Curry thought he could silence him with a gesture, but that didn't happen. Jimmy Butler's words, spoken without batting an eye, went down in NBA history. And before you move on to this story, take a second to subscribe to this channel. Then, at the end of the story, let's discuss who was right in the comments. Stephen Curry, as president of the NBA, appeared in front of the cameras that morning for the big Basketball and Community Summit held before the season. The topics were straightforward and clear: new infrastructure investments, support for young players, and NBA Academy projects. Everyone knew that what would be said had been written in advance. That is, until Jimmy Butler entered the meeting room. That morning, Jimmy had arrived on the first flight from Miami. He looked tired, but he also carried a heavy burden on his shoulders. The concrete of the courts was almost crumbling, the hoops were broken, and thousands of children had long since lost their potential because of this. In his hand was a black folder containing notes, photographs, and letters from street courts. These were not just stories. They were the realities of hopes left behind. The meeting took place in a huge NBA hall called the Locker Room. Curry opened the meeting with charisma and controlled energy in his suit. What he said sounded good. He talked about sponsorship, digital infrastructure projects, and virtual coaching programs. But Jimmy just listened intently. After Curry, several former players and managers gave short speeches. Everyone was saying similar things. Nice words, but empty. Then it was Jimmy's turn. No one actually said, "Go ahead," to him. He didn't ask anyone either. He just leaned forward and stared at Curry and began to speak. "Mr. President, there's still no electricity on the courts. The kids are trying to play at night under LED-like lights. After it rains, we try to dry the ground with whatever we can find." The room suddenly felt like it was on fire. It was as if someone had turned off the air conditioning. An official looked up from his notebook. Jimmy continued, "You talk about opportunities, but in the places where this game was born, there are still places that don't even have nets. Despite this, those kids are trying to play basketball, but you've turned their courts into carpeted fields." The words were simple, but they hit hard. Stephen Curry turned his head to the right, then back to Jimmy. "Are you done?" he asked. Jimmy opened his eyes even wider and replied, "I have 10 seconds left, but I think we should ask this question. Are we really trying to make basketball equal for everyone? Or are we just polishing the window?" The room fell silent. You could almost hear the sound of a pen scratching and someone taking a deep breath. The cameras were no longer focused on Curry, but only on Jimmy. Curry couldn't say anything. He leaned over to his assistant sitting next to him and whispered something. The assistant nodded. A few seconds later, NBA security guards entered the hall through the side door. Their eyes turned to Jimmy. A different energy had formed in the hall, but it wasn't like an explosion. It was just a subtle feeling of pressure. But Jimmy didn't even move. He didn't make a sound. And without looking away, he just raised his head slightly and looked back at Curry. His gaze seemed to say, "I'm not done yet." One of the security guards, a young man, straightened his NBA jacket and took a step forward. His eyes scanned the room. He wasn't aggressive, but he seemed to be waiting for an order. Curry tapped the table twice with his fingers. The meaning was clear. "Mr. Butler," said the attendant, in a low, respectful but commanding tone, "we're going to have to ask you to leave." But Jimmy raised his fingers in the air to speak before the attendant could continue. "I'm fine," he said. His voice was calm, of course. In fact, he seemed to be calming the attendant down more than anything else. "I just had a question." The chairs in the hall began to creak, and the sound of rustling paper could be heard. Everyone held their breath at that moment. It seemed as if it was no longer the ordinary media day they were familiar with. The moment when they faced the reality of basketball had begun. The security guard remained where he was. His hand was still in the air. Jimmy spoke calmly, without taking his eyes off him. "These kids sweat it out every day on half-broken courts. That's all I'm saying. If that's a problem, then I shouldn't be the problem. The real problem is what we see before our eyes." An elderly man sitting in the back row adjusted the collar of his suit. This figure was Coach Wallace, a former NBA coach. He was known as a tough guy, But at that moment, he took off his glasses and looked at Jimmy and asked him, "Which one did he do, in your opinion? Did he threaten him? Did he raise his voice? Did he insult him?" There was silence. The atmosphere in the room changed, and all eyes turned to Curry. Curry didn't say anything. Only his tense facial muscles were noticeable. At that moment, Jimmy opened a letter in his file. He read something from it for a moment, then turned his eyes back to Curry. "I received this letter from a young boy in Miami. He said he was thinking about quitting basketball because every morning 8 kids fight over the same basket, and he doesn't even have shoes to play in." These words echoed through the room, hitting their target like a three-pointer on the court. They were clear, sharp, and indisputable. The security guard hesitated for a moment. His eyes turned to Curry, but Curry remained silent. It was as if the gravity of the situation had overwhelmed him for a moment. Just then, another voice rose from the other end of the table. This time, it was Coach Rivera. He was an experienced WNBA coach. His words were careful, but sincere. Maybe that's the real point of this conversation. If it bothers us, who knows? Maybe that's why we need to hear it. The cameras in the room began to shift. The C-SPAN broadcast turned from Curry to Jimmy, and now his voice echoed across the screen. At that moment, Jimmy stood up. He wasn't fast or angry. He was just clear. He stood up straight and kept his gaze steady. "If talking about young people not being able to play on the fields bothers you so much, then perhaps this is the discussion we need most." He spoke slowly, but with conviction. When he finished, he left an impression on the room. The silence that followed was louder than any applause. Curry tapped his fingers on the table twice more, but the security guards didn't move. It was clear that they were confused too, and perhaps they had already sensed that something had changed. Jimmy, however, didn't let anyone else witness this moment. He slowly gathered his papers, quietly pushed his chair back, and walked toward the door. He left without even looking back. Just before leaving, he caught the eye of a young intern who was standing in front of him. The girl was perhaps 20 years old. Her gaze was neither admiring nor pitying, but rather seemed to say, "I understand you very well." When Jimmy left the room, the atmosphere inside became even more tense. No one was talking anymore. All eyes were on Curry. He just stared at the empty chair where Jimmy had been sitting and said, "We can continue." But no one could really continue. Jimmy hadn't even left the building yet. He was still walking down the long hallway at the entrance. The sound of his shoes on the floor created a focused tempo. He was about to reach the front door when he received his first notification on his phone, then another one, then 3 or 5 more. Without even looking at his phone, he saw a small group of press members waiting for him outside. They weren't allowed to enter, but the silence coming from inside had already put them on alert. When Jimmy came out the door, he had a security guard with him, but he was walking silently, one step behind Jimmy. It was as if he wasn't directing him, but rather bearing witness to him. As they walked away from the building, Jimmy's phone was still vibrating. ESPN, Bleacher Report, The Undefeated. They had all made it their headline. One of them read, "Jimmy Butler interrupts NBA meeting, but he had the last word." But he hadn't made a statement yet. He hadn't even spoken. He was just walking. At that moment, it was as if the whole country had started listening to him. Later in the evening, Curry was responding to other speakers with shorter, angrier sentences. When Coach Rivera tried to speak again, Curry interrupted him harshly and disrespectfully. "We're here to talk about sports, not cafeteria food." The PR teams in the room took notes with looks of concern and hesitation. Although it sounded like a small remark, everyone knew it was being recorded. At the end of the table, an advisor pushed a phone toward Curry. A headline caught his eye. Curry kicked Jimmy Butler out of the meeting because he couldn't tolerate the question. Curry stared at the headline. His face suddenly tensed. It felt like the collapse of a carefully planned operation. The initial goal was to send a unity message, leave a few polished statements for the media, and leave. But there was something he hadn't accounted for in this plan. Jimmy Butler really did make a truthful statement. He had turned the NBA's media narrative upside down. In fact, he hadn't just made a statement, he had demanded answers. And these answers were not only for those sitting at the table inside, but also for the millions outside. After leaving the building, It was getting dark when he arrived at his hotel in downtown Miami. He entered his room with only a briefcase and a backpack, without luggage or security. As soon as he closed the door, he let out a deep sigh. For the first time that day, there was silence. But unfortunately, this silence could not drown out the noise outside. Notifications continued to pop up on his phone. He sat down on the edge of the bed. First, he took off his shoes. Then, without even turning on the lights, he looked at his phone screen. Every new notification on social media was like another echo. Speak up, Jimmy. Chata courts, not politics. Our potuses, Sokaklar on ESPN. The commentators were trying to analyze the footage. Jimmy didn't actually raise his voice that much, but everyone was shaken by his voice. CNN commentators were discussing how this incident was not just about sports, but a point of social collapse. The Fox Sports presenter took a different view. A player should never go against the president. Unity is essential in the league. But the public strongly disagreed. The first message came from a former basketball coach. It was a photo of a handwritten letter. I don't know you, but I saw that you showed leadership in the meeting room as well as on the court. You spoke up for your young people. Thank you for that. Another message was from a teacher in the Bronx. We don't even have a basketball hoop. Our boards are broken, but I showed your video to my class. My students said it was the first time they felt like a star understood them. Each message was different. They varied like a geography lesson, but the sentiment was the same in almost all of them. Someone had finally spoken the truth out loud. At that moment, Jimmy's assistant, Malik, knocked on his door. He was holding a laptop and headphones. Jimmy invited him in. He looked tired, but alert. Buddy, I just need to show you this, Malik said. He opened his laptop. MSNBC was live. The anchor was talking excitedly. The person with us tonight challenged not only the NBA on the court, but also at the microphone. Welcome, Jimmy Butler. Jimmy shook his head and asked, Am I going to be connected? Malik silently nodded. If you want, he said. Jimmy thought for a moment. Then he took the laptop in front of him and turned on the camera. He was wearing a plain gray t-shirt. There was no makeup on his face and no crew behind him, just Jimmy and the truth. Thank you, said the host. What happened in the NBA today affected all of us. But I want to ask you this. Mr. Jimmy, did you expect your statement to have such an impact? Jimmy shrugged at first. His voice was slow but clear. Of course not. Because I wasn't speaking to make an impact. I was just very tired. Because this league gives kids a dream, but then it leaves them in the ghettos. I came from that game, and I know that some of them will never achieve their dreams. The host was silent. For a few seconds, only Jimmy's breathing could be heard. I didn't say anything fancy, he continued. I just asked why some fields still don't even have nets. That broadcast nearly broke the internet again. Teachers watching the live broadcast on a projector in the basement of a church in Newark clapped their hands. A janitor at a community center in Oklahoma stopped the broadcast and said, he definitely didn't raise his voice or yell. He didn't lie either. He just told the truth. In Missouri, when a woman who owned a cafe turned on the television, one of her customers grumbled, "Not these political athletes again?" Without turning her head, she replied, "But Jimmy didn't yell. He definitely told the truth, and the truth concerns all of us, sir." The next morning, Jimmy Butler was on the road again. This time he was headed to Orlando. The visit had been planned months in advance. His goal was to support fields with inadequate infrastructure, but now his every move was like a flash of light. In other words, his every move was being watched. A young female attendant approached him at the airport. "Are you Mr. Jimmy?" "Yes," said Jimmy. "My brother watched your video. He plays in the neighborhood field. What you said has opened another door for him. Thank you very much." Jimmy smiled. "Tell him we're still fighting, ma'am. It's not over yet." That day, for the first time, he took a deep, relaxed breath, because he knew he wasn't alone anymore. Of course, this was just the beginning. The silence that began at an NBA meeting was now echoing under every basket, because it wasn't just a saying, it was a turning point. When Jimmy went on a school visit in Orlando, a whisper began to spread wherever he stepped. Students whispered among themselves, and teachers nodded slightly when they met each other's eyes. The hall was ready. It wasn't like a sports hall, but rather a multi-purpose hall in an ordinary school. The chairs were metal, and there was a slight crackle in the sound system. But people had gathered there, because Jimmy was there. When Jimmy stepped through the door, the hall fell silent for a few seconds. There were no spotlights or media, but all eyes were shining with a different kind of light. Jimmy walked to the front of the stage. There was no microphone, and there was no need for one. Jimmy began his speech. Before I came here, all I could think about was that I couldn't even remember the exact words I said at the NBA Center that day. But I do remember this. I was tired. I was tired of a career spent walking in silence. Because outside, those kids are fighting every day just to find a basketball hoop. After the first sentence, the hall was still silent. One of the teachers stopped taking notes and was listening intently. A student sitting next to him had put his backpack on the floor. All eyes were on him. "I didn't come here to be a star," said Jimmy. "You know that stars shine up above, but the ones who shine on the field are already sitting in this room." A teacher stood up. With tears streaming down his face, he said, "Of course we try to give our children hope, but every day we wake up with something missing. Mr. Jimmy, what do you think we should do?" Jimmy didn't rush to answer. He took a deep breath first. Then he continued, "We must never stop speaking the truth. Documents alone are not enough. Reports are not enough. What we really need is a voice. We need a real voice to make ourselves heard by those who cannot hear us." After Jimmy's speech, everyone had the same phrase running through their minds. He was no longer just on the field, he was now in the hearts of the community. After the event, a child, probably around 12 years old, came up to Jimmy and handed him a folded piece of paper without saying a word. Jimmy opened the paper when he got into his car. The note was written in pencil. "I may not be able to be like you, but I can definitely talk like you, and I'll start in my own classroom." Jimmy pressed the note to his chest for a moment. His eyes closed, because he understood. This fight was no longer personal. At the same time, messages continued to pour in from all over the country. Teachers shared photos from their classrooms, showing water dripping from the roofs of school halls and filming videos of missing lockers in changing rooms. But these posts were definitely not complaints. They all had the same hashtag, #Susturmadil Dinlamek. Not silence, listen. On Reddit, a coach shared a photo of a schoolyard without a basketball hoop. He wrote, "After you spoke, my kids started collecting money among themselves, because for the first time, someone heard their voices." And Jimmy's face wasn't even in any of the images, but his voice had resonated throughout the country, and its impact had gone far beyond the speech he had given that day. The atmosphere was different in the NBA's executive suite. A closed strategy meeting was being held, led by Stephen Curry. Media directors, crisis managers, and PR consultants were all there. A note was being passed around. It read in large letters, "We couldn't silence Butler. Let's make him invisible." One consultant immediately objected. "But the videos are everywhere right now. You can't silence him anymore. He broke his silence." Another official took a deep breath and said, "That's why he shouldn't have spoken." However, outside, things had taken a different turn. Students at a high school in Sacramento were boycotting classes. They were standing in the hallway holding signs with their own handwriting that read, "If we don't have a phylum, we don't have a dream." One student spoke to the cameras. "I watched him on TV. It was as if someone was talking to us for the first time, and not from on high, but as if he were right there beside us." The students weren't just protesting, they were also offering solutions. Local news channels began broadcasting the events live. It was no longer just about Jimmy, it had become a system. Of course, the pressure was also increasing. Some NBA executives had already begun to bring up Jimmy's sponsorship deals. All this talk could harm all the brands, they said. Some media outlets also published articles saying he was too political, but Jimmy didn't respond to any of them. He continued his work without interruption. When he returned to Miami, he stood in front of the court where he used to practice as a child. The wire fence was now rusty. One of the hoops was bent, and the other had been torn down. He saw the young people from the neighborhood coming with paintbrushes and spray cans. "Mr. Jimmy, after your video, we wanted to take care of this place," said one of them. "After all, this is ours, isn't it?" he asked. Jimmy smiled and nodded. "Yes, of course," he said. "And now no one can ignore it anymore, son." This was no longer just an NBA story. It was, of course, the story of a community finding its voice. And Jimmy had become the figurehead of that story. But he didn't want to be a symbol yet, because it wasn't over yet. The reckoning had not yet come. Jimmy Butler wanted to be responsible for the silence echoing behind the videos that made him famous, rather than the videos themselves, because that silence was no longer in a room, it was in a country. It was the cry of years of silent progress, of ignored youth, of broken dreams. About 2 weeks later, Jimmy hit the road again. This time, his destination was a public high school in St. Louis. It wasn't a fancy event, of course. There was no stage, no podium, just folding chairs, a broken microphone, and a packed gym. Parents, students, teachers, and even people from neighboring towns were in the gym. Many of them had never seen Jimmy before, but his voice had already touched their lives. Jimmy stepped to the edge of the stage. He had a few notes in his hand, but he didn't look at them. What he was about to say wasn't memorized. It was based on his own experiences. He began his speech. "The roof was leaking where I first played basketball," he said. "Water would pour in during the winter. We would wipe our balls with our coats so they wouldn't get wet. But as a kid, I never thought, will I make it to the NBA one day? No. The only thing I thought was, will I be able to come back to this court tomorrow?" There was complete silence in the hall at that moment. A mother held her child's hand tightly. A teacher took off his glasses to wipe his eyes. Because everyone knew that these words were not just an ordinary story. They were a reminder of the truth. Jimmy continued, "When I entered that hall that day, I had no idea what I was going to do. But for every moment I stood there in silence, thousands of children were paying the price outside. I couldn't bear it any longer. That's why I said those things." A parent stood up. He looked like a construction worker. His hands were calloused and his voice was a little tired. "When my daughters watched your video, they asked me, 'Dad, can we talk like that one day?' I said yes, because now I know that those who speak out are no longer alone." Jimmy turned to him. "That's why I keep going," he said. "Even if you don't say anything, we're still in the same field." The applause didn't rise immediately. First a few fingers, then a shy rhythm. But the truth was this. This was not a speech designed for applause. It was a speech designed to wake people up. After the speech, people didn't crowd around Jimmy. They just thanked him, because they didn't see him as a famous star anymore, but as one of their own, someone who had sweated under the same pot. However, that night, a new wave began in the media. Some publications said that Jimmy was threatening the stability of the league, that sponsors were uncomfortable, and that some board members thought he should keep quiet. But this was not a step backward. It was a defense of the system, because when they realized that Jimmy wasn't going to shut up and that they couldn't silence him, they said he had gone too far. But at the end of the day, Jimmy opened one of the emails that had arrived at his hotel room. It was a long letter. It was handwritten, but scanned into a PDF. The sender was a retired colonel from Pennsylvania. "Actually, I don't support you. I don't like your politics. But when I watched you, I noticed something. You never raised your voice, and you never lied. You just held up a mirror to all these people, and we were always afraid to face that mirror." Jimmy read the letter 3 times. Then he folded it carefully. He placed it in the small wooden box he carried with him. That box was now like a shelf where he kept his trophies. Inside were only letters, little notes from children, and the voices that rose from the silence. The next morning, when he arrived at his office in Miami, his assistant Malik greeted him at the door. He was holding a note in his hand. "Jimmy, you need to see this, buddy." The note was from a school principal in Tulsa. "We would like to invite you back to our school," it said. "After watching you on television, the children talk about you as if you were their chosen hero. But I want you to know, they are not cheering for you. They really look up to you." Jimmy bowed his head. "It's dangerous to be looked up to," he said quietly, "because then they ask questions. They talk, and you can never shut them up." That day, as he walked through the streets of Miami, a few children were playing basketball. The hoop was badly bent, and the net was torn, but they were laughing. One of them noticed Jimmy. "Sir, are you that guy on TV?" he asked. Jimmy smiled. Maybe. You weren't afraid. We won't be afraid either, said the child. Those words stuck in Jimmy's mind, because now he knew that this fight wasn't about a tweet or a conversation. It was one of the first steps in rebuilding the future. That day, he had been silenced in a hall, but no force could silence him, because there was one thing they had forgotten. The truth echoes loudly, and once they spread, you can never gather them back, no matter how hard you try. Who do you think is right in this story? Write your thoughts in the comments and share this video with a friend who loves basketball. Don't forget to subscribe, because voices that are silenced are louder when they are united.